Welcome to the Protection Pros podcast, brought to you by CPPS, the leading provider of workplace violence solutions. I'm your host, Stacey Brown. Join us as we explore the world of security leadership through the lens of the pros who live it. Hey, Korey Staley, how the heck are you?
Great. It's great to be here.
Good. It's good to have you. I'm really excited about this opportunity. You and I have been friends for a little while now. I know a lot about your background, but I just kind of wanted to give a quick overview and then we can kind of dive right into it. So you spent over 3 decades training, experiencing, and then of course, teaching the skills needed to survive in the most extreme environments possible. And in that time, you educated military, you educated foreign forces, civilians to identify and evade extreme threats. So I'd kind of like to start with, you spent over 3 years in combat, which is incredible. Thank you so much for your service. But at the end of that time, you were the deputy team chief in Afghanistan for a year-long deployment. So I think it's probably safe to assume that some of your greatest stories can't necessarily be told, at least in this forum. However, we could talk a lot about your insight. And so that's kind of what I'd like to pick your brain about. So if you can kind of give us a little overview of what some of your responsibilities were, some of your greatest challenges, things of that sort, that would be helpful.
Yeah, is the last position I was holding there, in the last year-long deployment. As a deputy team chief, I was in Kunar province, Afghanistan, actually. And what I was sent there to do was to mentor, essentially would have been like the chief of security for the Kunar province. He had many police stations and some Afghan army people that he was responsible for making sure that they had all the security stuff that they needed, that they would be able to anticipate threats, even maybe gather intelligence about what was going on. He had police outposts and stuff. So going into that particular position, I think one of my biggest struggles were, as the first time I met him in Asadabad over at the province headquarters, and I go over there and I think I'm going to have the job. We're going to sit down here just like this. We have a discussion and we're going to talk about how many outposts do you have? What are the biggest threats that concern them? What are some things that you need to consider? Do you have any trouble getting them supplies and stuff they need? How much intelligence do you have? I thought we were going to go straight into these conversations. The biggest problem I had with him initially was that he didn't want to talk about any of that stuff. So as I go in there having the conversation with him, he's, pretty much hit a pause button on me and he's like, started asking me about my family.
Which is probably super unexpected in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last thing you expect to talk about.
Of course, our culture, we want to get to it. We want to get stuff done. We want to fix issues that are going on. And he wants to know, how many kids do I have? What are their hobbies? Do they like to play, football, American soccer? Where do they go to school? What do they do in school? What subjects do they like? What is my wife's name? What does she do? All these questions. And to the point where I get this. I appreciate you asking me about my family, but we've got a security issue here that hopefully I can help you out with.
Yeah, kind of in the middle of a war here.
Yeah, so great. But, and really, he didn't want to hear about any of that, because what I realized is that until I had built some rapport with him, that he didn't want to hear anything I had until we had established a personal connection. He didn't trust me or feel that I was in any position to give him any advice because he didn't know who I was as a person. So that's something that was a little bit of a surprise that we had to do. And it really came down to part of the culture of that particular organization and the difference in their culture compared to the culture that we operate in. So there's quite a bit of difference there. But knowing that I had to take it was very apparent right off the bat that I had to take a step back and figure out what it was that made this person motivated to want to fix whatever security issues he had. And I had to establish that connection with him. And we had to, it was probably a month and a half of just having conversations about our family before he would even take anything in consideration about what I had to say about security, regardless of, any resume that I had that was completely irrelevant to him. He wanted to know about my kids.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
And so you had to build this relationship, establish this rapport, and until he trusted you, then he'd start learn.
Eventually.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. He was an interesting guy. His name was Amon, but it was an interesting fellow, and it was difficult to establish that connection with when I wanted to get to work and he wanted to get to know me. So I have a friend that Tony Salinas just wrote a book a while back, but he refers to that as drinking chai. So if you go in and you sit down with them, so Tony, he's a colonel now, sits down, he wrote a story about it, but he sits down, he takes up his chai and he drinks it. It's really hot. It burns his mouth. And the people around him in the meeting that we were having, they all started laughing at him. We're just kind of like, Tony, what are you doing? And what they described to him later was, no, the chai has to cool. First, we have to talk. We have to get to know each other before we can even get to the chai. So let the chai cool down. We'll talk. And then when it's time, then we'll drink the chai. But that's what he referred to it as. It always kind of stuck with me, but yeah.
That's interesting. So there was those cultural obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
Can we kind of take a couple of steps back and just give us like a little overview as to your military experience? Because you have quite a lot of experience in doing, but you also have a lot of experience in leading. So can you give us a little bit of insight into your leadership experience and kind of how that all unfolded?
Yeah, so I joined in 93, initially joined the Army in 93, went to basic training, active duty. From there, I went to 101st Airborne Division where I got bumped around a little bit, but eventually I was in the long range surveillance community, or essentially our job was to, jump in behind enemy lines and pinpoint targets and report it back to the division intelligence team for them to analyze it. And they would give us a new target. We'd go into a planning process and we'd jump in again and pinpoint those targets. And then from there, I kind of bounced around in the recon community, was a sniper for a good number of years, a sniper section leader. Eventually, after moving around a little bit, I was a drill sergeant for quite a while, and was a sniper instructor for a pre-sniper program at JBLM over near Seattle or Tacoma. From there, I was in Colorado for a while. I would spend some time in Hawaii, and then eventually back over on the west side of Washington State again, where I ended up retiring the end of 2015, and then came to Spokane, and from there kind of contracted with the Department of Defense and captivity survival training for primarily Air Force. That's where I worked with some foreign military also, training them how to essentially like how to survive every spectrum of captivity you could possibly imagine, dangerous situations. And a lot of it really comes down to, part of that is building rapport, whatever that happens to be. Is, I say building rapport with this gentleman I'm on, the security director at Kunar. Again, it's building rapport with whoever it is your captor happens to be at the time. And we get into a lot of that too, even with the civilian sector and the training and teaching people how to deal with terrorists and stuff like that if they were ever held captive. But it's definitely an interesting field.
Right. And so you have a lot of insight into leadership, into management, whether, was it with the military or in the private sector and so on and so forth. And so is that what kind of inspired you to write your book? I printed off just a copy of it, The Fieldcraft of Leadership. Was that the inspiration behind the book, or can you give us a little overview as to what that entails?
Two things is just the concept of leadership in general. I just love it. I love the concept of being able to influence somebody to a greater good, a common goal, whatever that happens to be. And through, 22 years in the military, there was a lot of stuff that was passed down to me that you don't necessarily learn in a classroom, that you don't learn in a textbook. It's those little bit of tips. That's what we refer to as the fieldcraft. It's those little tips that are passed on to like able to get someone to do what it is that needs to be done or to influence them. And it really comes down to part of that, I guess, would be just being able to build rapport with your people, like establishing a good, genuine connection with your people, having a good culture so that they actually want to follow you, right? They have to be able to trust and respect you. And that's what it comes down to. So I just took, the nine best tips that I had learned that got passed down to me through trial and error, because some of them I didn't exactly do all that well at myself. But, being able to look back at that and reflect on that, I realized how some of the stuff that I could have done better. And so essentially I wrote that book for, the 25-year-old me. What are all the tips that I would have wanted when I was 25 to help me get ahead, to help me build a stronger team, to help me build a good culture, to help me influence people? And that's who I wrote it for. It's what they say, right? Is you are your own best coach of yourself, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Of your
So that's
previous
what I was
self.
doing,
Yeah. So that's yeah, and that's inspiring because it's like you had to learn a lot the hard way, but why does everybody?
I definitely learned the hard
Right?
way in a lot of things, yes.
So are there any situations or experiences that you had that shaped the way that you view your leadership or that impacted you the most? Is there any situations that you can share with
Yeah, well, there's
us?
definitely a couple of things. One, I always tell my guys that you'll pick up the strongest traits of your leaders that they have, some good, some bad, and you need to be able to identify exactly what those are so that you pick up the good ones and they stick with you, and you try to get rid of the bad ones, because all the leaders that you have are not going to be good ones. We all know this. We've all had to experience that, and hopefully we've learned from that and moved on. I've probably learned just as much from that realistically as I have some of the good leaders. As far as experience personally, to me, there's being young and eager. There was times when I wish I could have told myself to slow down, grasp the entire situation before you try to go head on. There's a time in Iraq, would have been around 2004, just north of Telefar. There was a smaller town that had been taken over. There, the police checkpoint had been taken over by a local insurgent group, and the police had been run out, and they'd called us in like, "Hey, we need to go take this place back." So they called our platoon in, and by the time we got there, they must have seen us coming, because you can see things coming off in the desert quite far. So right as we get there, they had kind of pulled out, and we went in, cleared out the building. There wasn't much left in there. People were gone, but you could tell there had been a bit of a battle there. And we had to hold this. It was far away, but we had to hold this until they could get some reinforcements from the Iraqis to come back in and retake the place. And up on top of that building all night, just looking around, seeing part of the population move around, stir around a little bit. They were watching us. We hear stuff on the radio that would lead us to believe that, they had us surrounded. They're massing forces on us. And the next morning, as it starts to get light, I'm on top of the building. I remember looking off the top of the third story down at some bushes across the street, and saw two guys over there with what looked like binoculars. I'm just getting like the sun reflection off of it just a little bit. I could tell they're over there. And again, being too eager, I end up taking a team of guys, pushing across the street. And as soon as we pushed off, they end up moving back around the backside of the building and taking off. Me being a little bit more eager than I should have been, took my team of guys. There was 5 of us at the time. I just grabbed a few guys, and we started pushing down the street after them. And as soon as we got about a block and a half away, they just opened up. It was just completely baited into an ambush with RPGs. Bullets were flying everywhere, and they led us exactly where they wanted us to, because I could tell, because they had the positions that they had set up they were able to shoot at us from multiple directions. So we didn't exactly have any place to hide. So the bullets were just kind of hitting around us. I'm not sure exactly how nobody got hit that day, seriously hit. We had some people wounded, but nobody got shot, luckily enough. We were able to eventually, grab another group of guys that were able to support us and lay down some fire so that we could back out. But yeah, that was the first time. I wish I could say it was the only time. That was the first time I ever got baited into an ambush. But the moral of the story, I think, for me, and how it kind of formed me, was to not be quick to just jump into something, right? You need to be able to make sure that you're assessing everything around you, make sure that you're taking in all the information so you can make the best decision, right? We never want to rush to failure. That's the military saying, never rush to failure. Get as much of the information as you possibly can so you make an informed decision, and don't being young and with a big ego get you into situations that, you probably shouldn't be in, which that day it did, and it did a couple more times for me, but
yeah, well, ego is a big one. And we hear that a lot about, leadership principles and, this emotional intelligence. And you talked a lot about, you have to earn the respect, right? You can't just
absolutely.
command the respect, as the rank doesn't give you necessarily
Yeah.
that respect. I mean, guys are literally trusting you with their lives, right? And so can you walk us through that? I mean, we don't all get to experience this. So just knowing that people are trusting you with their lives, what is that responsibility like?
Yeah, well, the responsibility. Well, first I'll say that a saying that I use quite often is lead as if you have no rank, right? You have to lead as if there is no rank on your shoulder. If there's, in the civilian sector, if there's no title in front of your name or letters after it, people don't follow you because you have letters after your name. They don't follow you because you have a particular title. They follow you because they trust and respect you. So are the actions that you're doing, are you relying too much on your rank? Are you relying too much on your title? Would they be doing that if you didn't have that title in front of you, right? What we want is for people to follow us, for us to be able to provide that motivation, that direction, compensation, all those things together combined, so that they will do no matter what it is, whether we're standing in front of them or not. It's part of that discipline thing. But that's creating a certain culture so that people actually want to do that. But if you establish a rapport, if you know somebody on a personal level, they might not always agree with you, but at least they respect you and respect your thought process enough so that they're going to want to do, because they respect you, they're going to want to do what it is that you feel is good for the goal, or the goal for the organization.
And so is that one of those lessons where you had to kind of learn through trial and error? Did you have an example that you were able to kind of watch and learn from, that you're like, I want to be like that? Like, everybody respects this person, or that's a great example of how I want to lead.
Yeah, just even, it would seem like even the simplest stuff. I had this brigade commander come down one time, and he was pretty well known for just kind of dropping in on us and seeing what's going on, seeing what the guys were up to on a day-to-day basis. And it was, it's a full-bird colonel, and it carries some weight in the Army, right?
Sure.
As it does in most branches. The guy's got 6,000 people that he's in charge of. They get ready to go to combat at the time, but brigade commander comes down to my company, and it's something simple, because as he's talking with some of the guys in the company, it was a PFC at the time, but he's talking to this PFC, this private first class. Yep, this private first class. And he's asking him, like, hey, what's going on? How you doing? He's like, well, my wife's, getting ready to deploy. She's heading to Afghanistan here in a couple of months. And Johnson was the kid's name. Johnson was pretty nervous about that, just that his wife's deploying, obviously.
Sure.
And a combat deployment is pretty dangerous. We'd all been there a couple times by then. But the colonel's like, oh, all right, let's talk to First Sergeant, make sure he gets you some time off so you can spend with your wife, whatever it happens to be. And of course, we're going to do that. But then, as the colonel and I were walking out, me and the commander of the colonel were walking out, this colonel pulls out a little pad of paper and he writes down just a note, just whatever it happens to be. It could have been a number of things that he was writing down because, the important stuff he has going on. But what he happened to write, it was, check in with Johnson in a couple months to see how it's going. If you got to spend some time with his wife, everything made it off okay. But he was just making that note in a book. And he looks up, he's like, hey, First Sergeant, always remember, like a short pencil is better than a long memory. So just write it down, right? Write it down. I'm like, okay. And then, sure enough to his word, 2 months later, it was about 3 months later, his wife had just deployed. He came back down and the colonel just showed up. Colonel Brown showed up and walked into the place. He's like, hey, First Sergeant Staley, where's Johnson at? Well, let me get him for you. So Johnson came up and he made that point to come down there so that the colonel's going to ask Johnson, he's like, how's your wife? Did she get there okay? Did you guys get to spend some time together? But this full-board colonel who had so much stuff to do, in charge of 6,000 people, is going to come down there and talk to this private to make sure that his wife's send-off was good, that she made it there, that they're doing okay. But because of that one simple thing, Johnson will follow that man anywhere, right? Regardless of how far away he is removed from the trenches, right? Johnson's in the trenches. Like we're the ones down there in the trenches. We're the ones getting shot at, doing the shooting and stuff like that. So for this colonel to come down there and get in the trenches with his people to find out, because he generally wants to know how things are going, like build a connection there. And even for me and everybody around to have seen that colonel come down and make that connection was huge. It was impactful, and we'll follow that guy. I still follow that guy. To this day, I'd follow that man anywhere.
That's incredible.
And even at the end, like I always remember, because this is the part that really stuck with me. He's like, as he came down there and he talked to Johnson, and then a little bit later he's leaving. He's like, yeah, this is by far the most important thing I'll do all day today. And that guy was probably going to go talk to 2-star generals after that about an upcoming deployment and what's going on, the dangers of the world. But he was making that connection with Private Johnson. That was huge. But,
yeah, your people are your most important asset, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Protect what you can't afford to lose with the Safe Workplace Suite by CPPS, the leading provider of workplace violence solutions. Empower your people, protect your brand, and align with standards. The Safe Workplace Suite includes everything your workplace violence program needs, like assessments, plans and policies, e-learning, instructor training, and behavioral threat support. CPPS is trusted by over half the Fortune 100 and endorsed by ASIS International. So visit safeworkplacesuite.com or check the show notes for more information. I'd kind of like to move into a little bit different topic. So I guess how we would translate this to kind of civilian terms is you were the security operations manager for over 300 personnel, 6 different units, and 4 different countries in Afghanistan, right? So, and then you also ran, you led the largest training event of around 1,000 personnel. And I was just wondering if there was a time when you had to really just learn the hard way, right? Like some of the greatest lessons we've had in life are because we've learned the hard way, right? Or at least that's what sticks with you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so, when it comes to whether it's leadership or just situational awareness under extreme pressure, can you kind of give us some experiences of, when you've kind of had to learn the hard way?
Learning the hard way. A couple things, I guess, is what I do know is that when there's extreme situations, extreme violence, whatever it's going to be, that you will always resort to your level of training, right?
Mhm.
You will always, however, how well you trained are, it will automatically come to you. So a little bit of training is better than no training, obviously. And the more you can add to that training, obviously, the better. And to the point where eventually you want to add some stress inoculation into that type of training. So to be able to have an outside source come in and add that, because we could easily replicate that in the Army, right? We have people specifically in the Army that's going to put us through situations where we don't know what's coming at us,
Mhm.
and an outside resource will throw that situation to us to add that element of stress so that we know how to deal with it. So when the situation does occur, that we know exactly how it is we'll perform, and we could rely on that.
That's right, and that's one of the greatest lessons. I don't even wanna compare, my experience teaching at the
Mhm.
survival school, to yours, but one of the greatest takeaways I would realize about that stress inoculation and creating this muscle memory is the first time someone goes through something extreme, even if it's a simulated environment, even if it's just training, right? Their blinders are on, and then they go through it
Mhm.
again, and their blinders are a little bit wider.
Yeah.
And then they're even so it creates this awareness, and you're able to think under pressure in these extreme environments. So I know there's a reason why special forces, they spend 90% of their time training,
Mhm.
before going into a situation so they could rely on that muscle memory, on that stress inoculation so they can really focus on what's in front of them. And so if you were to relate that to the civilian sector and
Mhm.
to organizations, as they're practicing their crisis management teams and these active assailant events, what advice would you have for just regular average
Yeah.
citizens or civilians that could be caught in one of these extreme events?
Well, for organizations, there's a couple things there. For organizations, one is see if you can find a way to add the element of stress to your training to make it that much more effective. The other thing too, and it applies to military and civilian sector, and I would tell my guys this all the time, is you have to constantly think about in your head prior to the situation happening. For us, it's when we're stateside and we're getting ready to go. It's the it's the what if all the time, like,
Uh-huh.
or I wish I would have, is what I would tell them. I wish I would have spent more time training on whatever it happens to be, because whether you're on top of a hill in Afghanistan surrounded by Taliban, what's going through your head is, I wish I would have spent a little bit more time making sure I knew how to apply a tourniquet. That's what's going through your head at that time. Because one of my guys might get hit and I might need to do that. I might not be proficient at that. I wish I would have spent a little bit more time learning how to coordinate different aircraft and knowing what assets they can bring to the fight. For a civilian organization, whether it's an active shooter, when that active shooter happens and you're sitting there like, I wish I would have spent more time learning what to do in this situation. I wish I would have spent more time learning how to prevent the situation. I wish I would have spent more time learning how to patch up this bleeding person. So think about all those situations that you have the time now to learn about it. Figure out what it is that you're going to wish you would have spent more time training on, and make sure that you do that. And just that you're able to, let go of your ego and accept what it is that you don't know, and
Mhm.
contact some outside resources or find out yourself, whatever happens to be. But just make that effort to learn exactly what it is. You probably don't even know a lot of what you don't know, right?
That's right. But that ego
Yeah.
is a big factor there.
And to be able to let
Yeah.
that go and find out what you don't know so that you can get some training on it, I think is key.
So having led these uh wildly massive training events.
Mhm.
How do you measure that? How do you measure the success of a training event?
Well, measures the success of a training event. It's kind of a twofold question. One is you definitely have to understand what the standard is that you're looking for, right? Um, but two, to meet the standard, and I would say more than anything, is you want to get buy-in from the people that you're training, right? That's what's going to make a successful training event, is to get buy-in. Whether it's in the military or civilian organization, is people are going to have much more buy-in when they participate in the planning process, when they have some ownership of it, right? And they make the rules for the training engagement themselves. Like if you're able to present it to like, okay, here's what we need. Here's the end state that we want to achieve. We want to be able to conduct a raid, right? Or we want to be able to react to an active shooter. And then have your people be part of the process to determine how it is you're going to train to that. Like come up with a training plan for it. Because as soon as they're the ones that come up with the training plan, whether it's conduct a raid or respond to an active shooter, they come up with a plan. They'll have some ownership. They'll have some buy-in. They're going to be much more likely to want to participate in it rather than just sit back and listen to you, preach to them about, how to do something.
Well, yeah, and it kind of forces them to kind of think through things that they wouldn't have otherwise thought through, right? Yeah. Like all the what ifs, like what if this happens? What if it's not a shooter? What if it's a bladed instrument? What if it's a backpack bomb? What if, so you're just playing through all these different situations. What if it's not in this environment? Yeah, what if I'm in an open event?
It's great too, is like as a leader to be able to put that guidance out there and sit back. As a leader, I think it's great. The stuff that they'll come up with are quite often stuff that you won't come up with yourself. You're just like, oh, that's brilliant. I don't know how I didn't think of that, but I'll take it. And they'll surprise you often, right? You give them the right incentive and a direction and let them go. And you'll be amazed at what they can come up with. Really amazed. Some of the youngest guys too, like some of the youngest guys, like right out of high school, even after having been in for, 20 years, some of these young 19-year-olds will come up with just the most amazing stuff. Why? Because you gave them a direction to go and you gave them the freedom to do it. And they will come up with some cool stuff. But
well, yeah. And sometimes, to that point, they don't have all the pressure that some of the higher ranking officials or some of the leaders have in that situation, right? And so they're seeing it through different optics.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think that's really important. And then I'd like to talk for a moment about recovery, whether it's, from a training event. I think this is the one thing that the military does very well, right? Is they kind of debrief a lot of whether it's a real event, a training event. Lessons learned is huge, right? So absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that and then kind of how to relate that to an organization and why that's important?
Oh, wow. The military, they debrief everything, right? Debrief, after actions review, whatever it is you want to call it, everything. Every week there's some sort of debrief on, what this week was supposed to look like. Did it look like that? Why didn't it? Goods and bads. And there's so much to take away from that. Otherwise, you just continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over. And as as new people are coming in your organization, old people are going out, that's a good way to analyze exactly how a training event went or an actual mission went. And it brings some continuity to the process, but at the same time, it allows some fresh perspective into how to solve certain problems too. So being able to have some good insight from all your people is extremely valuable.
And one thing that is kind of second nature, I know to the world that you come from is situational awareness, but it's not second nature for everybody, but it's incredibly important when we're talking about, building this security mindset, right? That's kind of that foundational piece. So what advice would you have for somebody who's never been in the military, always, been a civilian? What advice would you have for them or their families as they're traveling or just going about their day-to-day life on how to enhance or increase that situational awareness?
Well, the biggest piece of advice I would have for that is realistically, like, trust your instincts. It even goes back to the story I told earlier about getting ambushed. Like my gut feeling told me like,
something's off.
Yeah, you're being young and rambunctious here. Don't go out there without taking certain steps. Yet I did it anyway, and I didn't trust my instincts there. So if there's one piece of advice, I would say trust your instincts. There's obviously a few more steps you could do, just situational awareness, as far as like looking for what's out of place. Trusting your instincts when something does look out of place, and don't be afraid to say something. And it's okay to say something and be wrong, but yeah, trusting your instincts would probably be the biggest thing I would say to anybody trying to increase the situational awareness.
Yeah, because that really is that, like your body's built-in self-defense mechanism, right?
Yeah.
Should you tune into it though? And nowadays, like everybody's walking through life with either earbuds on or we're watching our cell phones. We're so distracted that we're blocking that instinct, right? And so I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but it's like, as we talk about our kids and teenagers and young adults, it's like tune into your environment, right?
As far as the military goes, it's distraction isn't quite as big of a thing. In the civilian sector, it definitely is, because in the civilian sector, we're so distracted all the time.
Mm-hmm.
In the military, you don't have that luxury. You know, your life's on the line. You can't be distracted. So you're constantly looking for what's out of place and going with that. But distraction is probably the biggest enemy of situational awareness. And it gets worse all the time. We've trained ourselves to just be so distracted with whatever it is, whether it's a screen or whether it's thought or whether it's what you need to do tomorrow. We're not paying attention to what's around us. It's extremely dangerous, especially you start going into different countries where people are looking, or, looking more to find you as an opportunity for them to commit some crime. And if you just lift your head up and look around a little bit, you'd find that it's actually pretty obvious when crimes are about to be committed. You can read people pretty easily.
Yeah, or it's just this, like, you could read the crowd, the feeling in the air. It's things are getting amped up, and it's like, it might be my time to kind of leave
Right.
before things really
Absolutely.
escalate here. So, well, this is all very good, but I would like to know, with all of your experience, with all of your knowledge, all of your lessons learned, and now, diving into this book, what is it that you want to kind of leave those in the private sector with, the security professional, the protection professional? Like, what advice or insight would you give that person?
It is kind of the highlight of everything we talked about. One primary thing would just be to know the culture of your organization, be in the trenches, working with the people, know what problems that they are facing every day, so you can have your thumb on exactly what people are saying, what they're thinking, what they're doing, and they know what their struggles are. You're able to help solve them potentially, or at least, if nothing else, you're building rapport with them by being in the trenches and going through potentially what are some of the same struggles that they're going through, right?
That kind of ties us back to, as we teach this stuff at CPPS, and as you have done, unless you're building those relationships with who you work with who you live with who's in your community, how do you know when something's off, right? How do you know when somebody is struggling, or when somebody's kind of having challenges in their life and kind of need that intervention, or how to recognize that, as they're on this, like, stairway, to progressing towards violence?
And with that, I would definitely say a lot of it really just, how well do you know your people? Like, what do you really know about them? Like, you have expectations of your team. You have expectations for them to want to put a certain amount of effort into the job that they do there, and have a certain amount of respect when they do it, and they want to achieve the goal, right? Because as leaders, we have this expectation of them. Well, your team has expectations of you too, as a leader, and your leadership is your commodity at that point, right? It's no longer about being able to, do whatever task it is. Now you're going to lead them. You're going to mentor them on how to do the task. But how well do you get to know them? How many kids do they have? What are their kids' hobbies? It comes back to my story with Amand, right? We're building that rapport. Like, how well do you really know them? And it's not always the information that you get from them. It's the process of getting that information. It's having that conversation with them, sitting here just like this, finding out about their family. And that's probably one thing I learned from Amand is much more able to influence the situation once we knew that information. And once we had a few cups of chai together, and there was much more trust and respect there, then we were able to influence that situation. But I got to know a lot about Amand. He was much better at the time. He probably got to know a lot more about me than I did him, really.
Right.
But I was just one of another person coming through every 12 months for him.
Well, and I think that's such an important takeaway from this, because, we all get caught up in the mission, regardless of what our missions are. We get so focused around that we kind of lose sight of everything else. And just that reminder of people are your greatest asset, right? Like, so build that rapport, get to know them, put your time into them, because that's what it all comes down to at the end of the day, right? And
Absolutely.
okay, so I've heard you talk a lot about, having to check your ego in this podcast, right? Ego is a big factor here, and that kind of ties back to emotional intelligence. What would be our last kind of takeaway as we talk about that through leadership perspective anyway?
Yep. Keeping the insight, as far as leadership, like keeping the insight in, that's the biggest thing, right? What you want to be able to accomplish, what you want your team to be able to accomplish, and be able to let go of your ego and making that connection with that person. So that how can you actually influence that person to want to get to the same goal that you do, right? Because they're not driven by the same things that you're not, but you're going to learn that through the talking process with them, right? But it's also not their business. It's not their organization, but how do you create that ownership so that they still have that drive to actually want to do that? No one's going to have as much passion about your business as you do, most
Mhm.
likely. You might be lucky and find some people here and there. So how to create that motivation outside of there and get to know those people. You got to create that common goal for them so that they actually want to achieve it. You need to make them feel like that they're family, right? That's like in the military, in combat. How are we able to accomplish as much as we do? How are we able to create such strong bonds over there? Like, because if you look back and forth at the person to the left or the right of you while you're over there, like that is your family. You've done so much together. You've gone through hardships together. You've experienced so many things together that even if you don't necessarily agree with that person, you might have completely different ideologies. You might be from completely different parts of the country, even the world, but you have that common goal. If that common goal isn't necessarily, um, a domestic threat, it might, or a foreign threat. It could just be surviving, right? So you have to find out what exactly that common goal needs to be for the organization so that you can bolster that.
Well, that's incredible. And I appreciate you sharing all of your experience and the insight here with us today. There's been a lot of lessons learned. And I think we have a lot more to talk about. So this is stay tuned. But I very much appreciate your time here
Thanks.
today.
Good to be
Thank
here.
you.
Good. Thank you.